This podcast is brought to you by EnergyX. Are you tired of paying huge rates to the big cloud providers? Are you worried about being booted off a cloud platform if your company doesn't meet their ever-shifting standards? Ready to step up your data security and disaster recovery game? Well, ladies and gentlemen, your new cloud is ready. Introducing xCloud, the scalable, resilient computing cloud that is also actually affordable. It's high-performance compute for half the cost. HPC for HTC. xCloud from Red Team is opening a beta program for new cloud computing customers, and that means you, my friend. The xCloud is powered by the XMDC immersion-cooled modular data center from EnergyX. I've seen this data center in operation, and it is a total game changer. So if you want more information about the beta launch, go to the URL in the description. Type in promo code BETA, B-E-T-A, for 50% off of your first instance. And so the URL is going to be digitalwildcatters.com/EnergyX. What is going on, Wildcatters? Welcome back to another episode of the podcast. It's Friday here in the studio. It's doom and gloom outside here in Houston, but I've got my new friend Jarrod McGehee with New Horizon Oil and Gas here to talk to us a little bit about exploration, the exploration game, the dying breed of exploration.
Yeah, it is a dying breed. There's not many of us left right now, it seems like.
Are there any more exploration departments anymore? Is it just like, hey, we're just going to keep drilling in the existing acreage that we have?
It's pretty much, that's how it is right now. There's just not as many out there explorers in the industry right now, and there's a big opportunity for the right people out there right now to go out there and drill some amazing opportunities in these deeper basins in like Gulf of Mexico and South Louisiana and Texas as well. I mean, there's really just an abundant amount of opportunities to get out there and do some real exploring.
So high level, I'm assuming you guys are going out there, you're exploring, you're producing. I think you said before we hopped on the mic.
Yep.
Southern Louisiana area.
Yeah, so I mainly focus on South Louisiana. That's where I began my career. And I've been working in South Louisiana for like the last 23 years. I've drilled over 50 wells down there. I have over a 70% success rate working drilling basically conventional prospects. I mean, when all these other guys went to the unconventional space, I decided to stay in the conventional world and go ahead and drill these amplitudes with AVO and structural closures and other, just basically normal, conventional, old school geologic plays that the Gulf of Mexico is known for.
Is this mostly onshore? Is it some of the shallow offshore stuff?
It's like, and most of the stuff I do is in shallow waters. So on dry land and shallow waters, kind of like south of I-10 is kind of where my honey hole is, and that's kind of where I focus on. All the way from the Texas border all the way over to eastern Louisiana, Plaquemine Parish. And
so whenever you're drilling in those shallow waters, is it like one of the little barge rigs?
Yeah.
Is that how that works?
Most of it's barge rigs. Most of it's like inland barge rigs. And we go out there, we'll bring out a barge. And so permitting can be a little bit tough sometimes. You got to go through the Corps of Engineers and work with the state of Louisiana. A lot of it's the state of Louisiana land I drill on. But there have been... in the past, they've had some issues with the legacy lawsuits, but that's kind of behind everybody. And there's been a lot of litigation, and the lawyers have figured out the best way to get around that or circumvent that issue the state has had in the past.
So like we said, this is like, exploration is definitely not as popular as it used to be. And I think it's a little bit of a shame. Like we did an entire series called Wildcatter History, and it was talking about how these guys would go out and just literally... with Creekology, just punch random holes in the ground and just have some absolutely massive finds. NRG, where NRG Stadium is, that used to be a massive salt dome oil field. A lot of people don't even realize that.
Yeah, I didn't know that
Huge discoveries were made over right where Astrodome is and where Astroworld and stuff used to be. Huge oil field.
Yeah.
And once upon a time. So
there
could still be some reserves there for all we know. But like what appeals to you about the exploration side? Like, what are you seeing that nobody else sees, or like, what are you equipped with that nobody else is equipped with these days?
So the key for us is having 3D seismic technology. That's basically the bread and butter of what we do. We use 3D seismic to identify structures and getting up dip of wells that were previously productive, to deepening reservoirs that were shallower sands, and just taking those same sands or same structures and migrating them deeper for some deeper targets, and also looking for amplitudes with AVO. A lot of what I do is I focus on amplitude with AVO. South Louisiana is one of the best places in the world that applies to, that science applies to. And so I kind of focus mostly on amplitudes with AVO, and then also structural closures, taking prospective fault blocks that are shallow or have production shallow and just migrating deeper to deeper sands.
All right, I'm going to ask some really dumb questions, and I'm sure I'm not the only one who doesn't understand what those terms mean. So amplitude and AVO, really quickly, what is that?
Okay, so basically when I'm looking at 3D seismic, an amplitude is just kind of like something on the seismic that's a little bit brighter. It's brighter than the rest of the background. And that just kind of indication of hydrocarbons. That just kind of shows you where hydrocarbons could possibly be at. Then AVO is the amplitude versus offset. So the further you get away, like you'll have a far response, which is basically like from 15 to 30 degrees away. And then you'll have a near response from 0 to 15. And so what you want is those fars to be brighter than the nears, than to your source. And that represents what we call AVO. So when you have an AVO response, that's a direct hydrocarbon indicator. And that really helps limit the risk of drilling a dry hole. So in reality, you can really limit the risk of drilling dry holes in these conventional reservoirs with the advent of 3D and amplitudes with the AVO component.
Okay. And then I think you said structural closures. What is that?
Yeah. So a structural closure, like we're looking at like 4-way closures, which are basically it's a hill. You're basically looking at a hill. And then we have faults that trap other closures down there in South Louisiana. Like we have, because you have to have a trap in order for the hydrocarbons to accumulate.
So you're saying multiple faults trapped in there.
Yeah, coming together. Or if it's a 4-way closure, there's no faults. It's just a giant hill.
Yeah.
And that's generally the best way to describe it. And that's where all the hydrocarbons accumulate at kind of the crest of that hill.
Okay.
Yeah. Hopefully that helped explain it.
No, that makes a lot of sense. What is I'll just get down to the nitty gritty. Like, what's the cost of drilling a conventional well these days?
Well, it depends a lot on depth and pressure. If you're drilling like a non-pressured well on dry land or using a barge rig, it's like $2 to $3 million most likely. If it's like say 10 to 12,000 feet.
Yeah.
If you're drilling a pressured well, which is generally around 12,000 to 15,000 feet, one string of pipe, you're looking at around 5 to 6 million most likely.
What's the average depth that you're drilling to?
Most of the things I'm drilling to are between 12,000 feet and 15,000 feet a lot of times.
Man, that's considered deep for me because the wells that we used to have were like 3,000.
Really?
Yeah, super
the stripper
shallow.
wells.
Yeah.
And so there's also 2-string pipe tests. You could go really deep, and that's where there tends to be the most underexplored part of the Gulf Coast Basin. There's some super deep opportunities there. Talking below 15,000 feet, going from 15,000 to 25,000 feet.
Yeah.
Like some of the best wells drilled in the last 20 years have all been drilled in that kind of like 18 to 20,000 foot range. And they're like 100 BCF discoveries and a couple million barrels.
Are you mostly producing oil or gas?
It's kind of a combination of gas and condensate.
Okay. Nice. What's the average? So I know you mentioned like 100 BCF or 100 BCF in some of those. With the stuff that you're normally doing, like what's the average EUR? Which I know is kind of like it's kind of a very subjective thing depending on the math, but
yeah, we're really looking at like a 7 to 20 BCF prospect for the majority of them, with a kind of 500,000 barrel to a million barrel potential. A million barrels of condensate along with that.
That's not bad at all.
No, it's pretty good.
Yeah,
the economics actually are really good for the conventional space. You just got to be able to tolerate some dry holes once in a while. I mean, it's not a perfect science, but the economics do look good. A lot of these things are, your goal is to make 2 to 1 your money with every one of these. You really don't even drill it unless you're going to make 2 to 1 your money. And so there's a lot of good opportunities still left out in this particular part of the world.
Absolutely. And so are you guys drilling these and then operating them, or are you drilling them and flipping them?
I basically just I bring in an operator to operate them for me, and then we'll just operate them. I'll partner up with the operator to come in and help me get the land.
Yeah.
We'll go get the land, then we'll put the partnership together, and then we'll drill the project and we'll produce it out.
So you go out and raise cash on an individual well basis?
Yes.
Or is it usually multiple wells?
Well, what's interesting is like in my early part of my career, it's always been on a one-on-one basis. I did work for Clayton Williams, who basically took 100% of everything for the first 8 years of my career. And then I went to work for another group called Houston Energy, and then we did everything kind of on a well-by-well basis. And so we'd raise capital on a well-by-well basis. But I've learned since 2020, when I kind of went on my own, Houston Energy still is a great partner of mine, and we still work together on quite a few things. But I've had some opportunities to sell some packages of prospects, and people really like those opportunities because that way you're kind of committed to drill 4 to 5 wells, and people really like the opportunity. If the first one doesn't work, you got a shot at 3 or 4 more opportunities.
Yeah.
So
you worked with Houston Energy a lot back in the day? Okay.
So I worked there from 2008 till
I haven't like kept up with what they've been doing, but they were like pretty big and active in the offshore space for a long time.
Yeah, they're huge in deep water right now.
Yeah.
Very, very active in deep water.
So they haven't slowed down at all.
They're not slowing down.
Okay.
They're just keep full steam ahead.
Yeah.
They're a phenomenal group, and I've been blessed to work with them and have them as a partner for a long time.
So you mentioned working with Clayton Williams, and we talked about it a little bit before we hopped on the mic. Give me a little bit of your backstory. How do we get here?
Well, let's start. I guess we'll start from the beginning.
Yeah.
Jake. I grew up on a pig farm in central Louisiana, or central Illinois. I grew up on a pig farm in central Illinois. And then I joined the Army when I was 18 or 17, and I realized I had to get the heck out of here because there was nothing to do in my little farm town of Illinois. And so I joined the military, went to Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri for a basic training in AIT. Was a combat engineer, so I had to learn to blow stuff up. And then they sent me to Seoul, South Korea. So I was in Seoul, South Korea for a year. And that was a pretty interesting time in my life.
Going from Illinois to Seoul, South Korea.
Yeah, first time I ever been on a plane. They put me on a plane going from Chicago to Seoul, South Korea. So it was pretty crazy.
That's wild.
And I spent a year there in South Korea. Then I came back to Fort Polk, Louisiana, which is like not Seoul, South Korea. It's a completely different world. And when I came back to Seoul, or from Seoul to Louisiana, I thought I was gonna have to buy like a P-row or something like that to get around because I thought it was all marsh. I didn't know that there's actually dry land in Louisiana, north of I-10. So there's actually a lot of forests and stuff like that around Fort Polk, Louisiana, which was pretty interesting. Then after that, my stint in the military, I ended up meeting a girl from Lake Charles, and she says she's going to school in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. I was like, well, is there a place I could go? And she's like, yeah, there's one called LSU. So I enrolled, got accepted to LSU, and never went there. I showed up on campus. They're like, well, what do you want to do when you grow up? And I was like, I want to make the most money possible. And they're like, become petroleum engineer. And so I literally got out of the guy's chair, walked over to the petroleum engineering building, and met Fred Thurber over there at the petroleum engineering college of petroleum engineering, and enrolled in petroleum engineering. And then so I got my very first week of classes. I had this geology lab in Howell Russell building for petroleum engineering, and I walk up to Howell Russell, and there's this guy named Ben Jamalva. He's a local geologist in town. He was doing some consulting for L-Log and consulting for Clayton Williams. And he was looking for a runner, a geologist, or petroleum engineering. And I was like, well, I don't know what a geologist is or a petroleum engineer is, so I better figure this out. So I called him up, went over to his office, and he lived in this really, really awesome house in South Downs area, like right outside LSU's campus. And I was like, you know what? I could probably do this. And Ben ended up hiring me and ended up working for Ben for 8 years. And I was grateful for that time there. He's a great man.
And Ben worked for Clayton Williams?
Yeah, he was a consultant with Clayton Williams.
Did you get to spend much time with Clayton?
I did. I was fortunate enough, like Ben always treated me really well, and he brought me over here to Houston quite a bit. So I was like traveling back and forth between Baton Rouge and Houston. And Mr. Clayton Williams, he has these really awesome parties. He was known for having these amazing parties. And so he always had a party down at the aquarium, the Aggie Christmas party. So we always went down there April 1st of every year, the aquarium, and had the Aggie Christmas party. And so it was pretty fun. You
got to tell me your favorite Clayton Williams story.
Well, I will say,
I know he's a character. I'm gonna tell you why I know these things. But I'm curious. Like, what is your favorite Clayton Williams story?
Clayton Williams, he always was on the dance floor, and every party I was at, he always was on the dance floor, and he was always out there with some of the best dancers in the entire room. I promise you that. I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, no, I've seen photographic evidence. So Chuck Yates, works with us, knows Clayton's right-hand man, Mel Riggs.
Yeah.
And so we got introduced to Mel. Mel introduced us to Modesta, had us over to Clayton's office a while back. It was cool. Nothing's changed since he passed, and it was just really surreal to get there and just see where he worked and get to meet her. And she gave us a full tour through the office, and was just the hallways are lined with photos of their life and the parties and having George Strait out there and singing. And all that stuff. And so it was a really, really, cool experience
And
for
the
us.
other thing I remember from Clayton Williams' parties, he'd always have like a big band, like you're saying,
Yeah.
at the early part. But at the end of the night, he'd always bring in his guys from the ranch to come in and sing. Like when he was out there hunting his hunting camp, he'd always bring in the guys from bring whiskey and beer and all those songs.
One of the things that people didn't realize, and I didn't know this until Modesta told us, and then I actually found some YouTube videos of this, but he was great at singing mariachi music.
Oh yeah.
And singing it in Spanish and just like totally nailing it like on the dance floor. And so you can YouTube it, look up Clayton Williams mariachi. You'll find a couple video clips that have made it to the internet. So
he was an absolute legend.
Yeah.
And it was a pleasure working with him. And Mr. Like I said, Ben Jamalva was treating me so good and let me be involved in all that stuff. So I'm really grateful for all my time with there. I've been blessed to work with some great people, Jake. That's really kind of what it boils down to.
There's a lot of great people in this industry.
You're right about that.
So you did that for 8 years. What was next?
Then I went to a NAPE, and I was walking around NAPE, and I saw these guys that had a booth that said, looking for a geologist, 1% are willing to pay override and salary. And I was like, well, that sounds like me. I'll sign up for that. And so I walk over to the booth, and I meet this guy, James Hart, and James is like, yeah, you got to go down to the end down there and talk to that guy down there with glasses. That's Ron Neal. And so that's how I got introduced to Ron Neal. And lo and behold, Ron Neal and Bill Harrison also went to LSU, and those are the founders of Houston Energy. So
okay.
I was pretty blessed. Kind of worked out, and I went to the office the day after that. I met Ron on that Thursday, and then I went over to his office on Friday afternoon, interviewed with him. Didn't hear anything for a few weeks. Then all of a sudden, I get a call one Friday afternoon from a guy named John Redfield, who was at Houston Energy, and said, "Yeah, we'd like to hire you." And there we go.
So what was your main focus there?
I was doing onshore exploration in South Louisiana, working some 3D surveys in like Plaquemine, Lafourche, and Jefferson, Terrebonne.
Yep.
It was a great experience. Had a lot of fun. We got to drill a bunch of wells and had a lot of success. And they've had a lot of success as a company. And of the last 20 years, they're probably the premier exploration company entire business. So I was fortunate enough to work at that with them at a great time.
That's awesome. So then was that the last company you worked for? Then you leapt out and decided to do your own thing?
Well, it's funny as COVID, I mean, it kind of affected everybody a little bit differently. And so I kind of looked at that computer screen when oil went negative in that day in April. And I was like, well, now's my opportunity. And,
there's only one way to go up.
It's only up from here. You're right about that. And so I was like, and then, Ron and Billy, they were very grateful and generous and said, Jarrod, they brought me in their office in July of that year and said, Jarrod's probably a really good time right now. If you ever want to start your own thing, now's probably a good time. You have our backing and we'll help you out, help you get started. And they were fortunate enough and gave me some office space to get started and started there on my own officially September 1st, 2020. And for the first year, I didn't really have I basically went off salary September 1st, 2020 for the first time in my life. And I had some cash coming in from some wells I drilled and stuff like that. And then Donald Trump gave the $100,000, you take out $100,000 from your 401k at that time, with no penalty. And I was like, took that out of my 401k account. And that kind of gave me the cushion and enough to get started. And I told my wife, Emily, who's been very supportive along the way as well. She's been great. I was like, honey, when this runs out, I'll go back and get a real job. But luckily, it kind of lasted me. And then when I was sitting there during COVID, got to learn a lot about other stuff. I mean, I was at home a lot. I was mapping a lot, making a lot of maps, doing a lot of just good old-fashioned geology and getting in there, working on the workstation, mapping every day from 6 a.m. till 9 p.m. every night. This was during COVID before, when I was still at Houston Energy. Then I started learning more and more about Bitcoin and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And, Raw Paul, I don't know if you know those guys at all, but they have a great, Real Visions are
okay. Yeah.
They're really good. So I started listening to Real Vision and stuff like that. Then they also had this thing called the carbon markets, which were first time I ever heard about it was on Real Vision. And that was in October of 2020. And I was like, man, this is interesting. And so I just started following the carbon markets and stuff like that. And then in So I was on my own from September 1st, 2020, just trying to generate prospects and come up with ideas and find some investors. And it was a horrible time to try to find investors to drill oil and gas wells. It was not good. But luckily I had the Trump money along with some savings, and that gave me the cushion to like kind of still live life with and not have to, stress too much. But it was getting down, and all of a sudden, I also know some folks over at Talos, Tim Duncan, who's CEO over there, John Parker, who are great guys. And John Parker called me up one Friday afternoon in June. This is like June 9th of 2021. John Parker calls me up and says, "Hey, Jarrod, what are you doing right now?" It was a Friday afternoon. Like I remember clear as day. It was Friday afternoon, like at 3 or 4 in the afternoon. I was making spaghetti for my kids in the kitchen, and I was like, "I'm making spaghetti right now." He's like, "Hell, he says, can you come in on Monday and we'd like to talk to you about something?" And I was like, "Okay." And so I was like, I'll go to their office on Monday, and they're like, "This carbon capture thing? Are you interested in doing something like this?" And I was like, "Sure, sign me up." So they offered me a consulting gig doing carbon capture, and I was part of the initial efforts for their carbon capture business there at Talos. I've been very blessed to work with some great people at Talos, with John Parker, Bob Abenshine, Robin Fielder, the great leaders, and have great leadership over there as well. And so I'm still doing consulting with Talos as well in the carbon capture industry.
We got to get Tim Duncan on the podcast.
Yeah, he's you know what? He'd probably talk for 2 or 3 hours straight, and you may not chance to speak. But no, Tim's a great guy. He's phenomenal. He's a great speaker. He's a phenomenal.
He is.
speaker.
He is. I saw him on it was a David Bleibman's podcast. I actually went and watched that, and we've been introduced. Hadn't had a chance to connect yet.
Yeah.
Through Chris Powers. I don't know if you know Chris Powers at Chevron.
Oh yeah.
On the CCUS side.
Yep.
Yeah. So we had him on the show a while back. Let's dive into since we're on CCUS, let's dive into that, and then we're going to get deeper on the exploration side. What are you doing on the CCUS side? Are you going and you're looking for reservoirs to actually deposit the carbon into, or?
Yeah. So that's basically what we're doing. We're looking for places to inject the CO2 into. So the goal here is you want to be near infrastructure, obviously, because that's kind of one of the keys to the whole play. And I mean, a lot of these people,
because you're not going to capture the carbon and then transport the carbon, and then
the cost is very high.
Yeah, it's got to be pretty much all.
We're basically reverse engineering what we do in the oil and gas business. We're just basically taking it from the plants. All that oil and gas we sent to the plants a long time ago, we're putting new lines in, coming back out from the plants, going back out to the oil fields, and injecting it underground to get the CO2 tax credit.
So what are you looking for in a place that the carbon can be injected into safely, sustainably, no issues, economically, all that? Like, what are you looking for?
It's got to be close to the emissions. So the key is like close to the emitters or close to a pipeline, like Exxon and Denbury kind of have that CO2 pipeline now. They call it the Green Line, which carries CO2 back and forth from like Houston area all the way up through Jackson, Mississippi. And the key is like you got to be below 3,000 feet. We're looking for like a good top seal. So we're looking for like a really, really nice shale, like a couple hundred feet of shale would be really, really nice. From basically looking from the interval from 3,000 feet to around 10,000 feet, because you want to be in that kind of non-pressure interval.
It's good to inject into the tight shale like that?
No, you want that as your seal.
As your seal. Okay.
So you're going to inject below the shale.
I was like, it sounds like you're making it harder for yourself than it needs to be.
So use that shale as like your seal. Okay. So it's like a seal, and you want that to be pretty contiguous throughout the area. So you want to inject into the sands below that top seal. That's what you're basically doing.
Yeah.
And these sands are these, the carbon will kind of dissipate into the CO2 or the saline aquifer, and you'll end up with a CO2 front or a plume, and it'll kind of migrate in the direction of dip, but it'll eventually stop migrating.
Yeah. So
it's pretty cool. So a lot of new technology, a lot of reservoir engineering has to go into these modeling. A lot of it's based off models right now. There's nothing has been done in the Gulf Coast so far.
So is it still? I know Chris and I talked about this, but from your perspective, is the kind of the commercial mechanism on this? Is this carbon credits or carbon tax benefits and things like that?
That's correct. Same.
Okay.
Thing. That's kind of the market right now is the carbon credits, and it's taking these large energy companies to come out here and do it because it's a very, very expensive process. It's not inexpensive by any means, but they're doing the best they can, and we're all doing our best we can to kind of save the planet one CO2 molecule at a time. Kind of like putting it back in the ground.
Yeah.
So
is there any limit to how much you can inject into
there
a single?
kind of is. I mean, you don't
I'll
want
say it probably depends, but
it's depending on the porosity and stuff of like the sands you're injecting into and the area, because you want to extend it. You want that plume not to grow too big, because it'll grow too fast, too big. You want that plume to kind of gradually grow, and then it'll move over time up in the up dip direction. But it's funny, you're injecting several BCF a year, several BCF to 20 BCF a year in these things. It's pretty impressive the amount of CO2 you're able to put away. It's compared to like an oil and gas well.
And are you able to do any sort of like EOR like you would a CO2 flood, steam flood, water flood with some of the carbon? I know that naturally a lot of this infrastructure is not co-located next to some of the actual upstream assets.
Denbury actually did do quite a bit of CO2 injection to extract hydrocarbons from existing reservoirs and EOR stuff. So there is a lot that is still an option for a lot of these places. I mean, it's been going on for a very long time, CO2 injecting in these wells, and so it's nothing new, nothing crazy new. It's just doing it for a different reason. Instead of doing it for EOR, we're doing it to like help the planet. So
could you still get the same tax credits if you were doing it for EOR?
It's a little bit less. So I believe I could be slightly wrong. I think it's $85 if you just inject it. It's like $50 tax credit.
$85 per ton?
Per ton, correct.
Okay.
And $50 per ton if you are doing it for EOR. I think they bumped it up to $50 per ton if you're using it for EOR.
So how many ton? Okay, actually, I'm just going to skip to the end of the equation. How much money on the BCF? How much money would you make on a carbon capture well on average if it's $85 a ton?
Well, the returns are not as good as the oil and gas industry. You're looking for like the margins are a whole lot slimmer. So if seems like they're making a 15% return, you're doing pretty good.
Okay.
Just to let you know.
Okay.
But these projects are extremely expensive. Like I said before, they could vary from $200 million is what I've seen the cheapest up to like almost $1 billion for some of these projects. These are very expensive projects.
Jeez. So in your position, right? So you're doing the consulting on the CCUS side. You're also doing the exploration. And because I'm curious about transition and the exploration side, but where are you seeing, as you're like seeing capital flow, are you seeing more capital flow into the CCUS stuff? Are you seeing, because obviously not as many people are investing into exploration, right?
That's exactly
so do you see that as something that's easier to get funded versus all the exploration stuff?
Totally right now, I believe so.
Even despite the more modest returns compared to.
Yeah. So what's interesting is I kind of look back at my career when I was had a lot of time to think, obviously during COVID and when I went on my own. And I was like, you got to kind of, there's spigots of money out there, and that's where the capital is going. And so the spigot of money right now, it was in shale for the last decade roughly, I guess 2010 to 2020, and now that spigot of capital is transitioned from the shale revolution to renewables. And so it seems like everyone wants renewables, or at least wants some piece of renewables, and those things seem to be getting funded a little bit easier than the oil and gas stuff. And to get oil and gas funding for the projects I do, we used to have private equity companies come in and fund a lot of it, and then other oil companies as well. Now we're using a lot of high net worth individuals, and a lot of family offices are funding the majority of the projects we put together in the oil and gas sector, and also oil companies as well.
So really quickly before we go to that, on the CCUS side, what is the outlook moving forward? Are we looking 5-10 years out and still locking in kind of these modest returns, or is there optimism that those will rise over time, either with new regulations, better credits, incentives, cost of building will come down? What's the
kind of a little bit of everything you just mentioned. Hopefully the technology gets a little bit better, the costs come down, we learn a little bit more as we start doing these wells, and it'll be a little bit cheaper. We'll have more infrastructure being built, so the projects will become a lot less expensive. And then also carbon credits will be treated as probably like a regular commodity, so they'll be traded and so on and so forth. So the carbon credits the tax credits could actually go up in value.
Yeah,
there's a chance for that as well.
Yeah.
And these projects, like when we sign these people up, we're signing them up for 12 years, 12 years at the minimum, 20 years as the most likely scenario for a project. Like a 20-year, most of these projects can be 20-year projects, but then you got to keep on monitoring it for up to 100 years. Make sure that plume doesn't move.
Yeah, it's a big commitment. 100 years.
It's a big commitment. Like
You're
it's
like,
a very long commitment.
My family is gonna have to monitor this after I'm
Exactly.
long gone.
Exactly. But you start doing these projects, and there's been a lot of capital devoted to it, and these tax credits have been actually around since 2008, but they were just so insignificant you really couldn't take advantage of them to make it work economically.
Yeah. So going to the exploration side. So you said that, back in the day, private equity companies were coming in funding this. It's not quite in vogue. It's not sexy anymore. You've moved more towards high net worth individuals. One of the things that I don't think we've ever talked about on this podcast, and we'd love to dive into it, is how do you structure these kinds of deals? So assuming it's one individual well that you're drilling, what is kind of the high level structure? Are you saying, hey, I'm putting up X amount of working interest, or I guess it could be overriding royalty interest or whatever, in exchange for the cash, you guys go drill. Hopefully it's not a dry hole.
Yeah. So basically how these things are structured is like, we ask for some type of cash up front to help reimburse our time, pay for the seismic. Because the seismic's not free, pay for, IT departments, pay for land guys, and pay for engineers to get cost estimates and stuff like that. So we do ask for some capital up front to kind of cover those costs. And then we ask for a little override, to as part of the bonus structure of like for the people kind of
skin in the game.
Yeah. That way you have some skin in the game and stuff. And then we'll also ask for, after the well pays out, you could do a couple different ways. A lot of people ask for third for a quarter, which is like basically, you basically carried in the well for a certain percentage, or another option would be after the well pays out, you come in after everyone gets all their money back, you come in for a certain percentage, So that's how I structure a lot of my projects I work on, is once the investor gets all their money back, I come in for a piece of the well.
I love that. I think that a lot of people don't understand how that works. So I'm glad we talked about it. How are you kind of like splitting your time now? And like, do you have a lot of wells that you're drilling currently?
I spend a lot of time working carbon capture right now.
Yeah.
Still it's a full-time, it's very, it's a full-time
It's enough
job.
to keep you busy.
Yeah. It's enough to keep me busy. And then I kind of do the oil and gas stuff on nights and weekends, stuff like that. And I have a pretty good network of folks who are friends of mine who participate in these wells. So it's, I developed over the last 20 years, but the carbon capture it's basically a full-time job. In fact, we're shooting a 3D right now. It's been the first time I've ever got to do that. So I'm doing a lot of fun stuff with that. I mean, the first 6 months on the team was like, I think you talked about, I heard one of your other podcasts with Peter Harding, and he's like, when you had that we had a 6-man team when we first started the projects, and we just were blowing and going, leasing like hundreds of thousands of acres. It was like just crazy. It was, and then, as you get these projects, then you got to start developing them and stuff like that. But we were just flying by the seat of our pants when we first did this, because I had no idea, along with everyone else who's working these projects, what you were actually looking for. And fortunately, we kind of cracked the code first on what we're really, obviously Denbury knew what they were doing, but we were one of the first companies out there to really crack the code on what we really wanted to go do. And Dave Middleton at Talos, he really helped me out to kind of understand the geology part of the CO2, and he was a big part of the early efforts there as well from Talos.
That's awesome. Do you think there's a future? Do you think exploration is going to grow?
What's interesting is I don't know, Jake, because there's not a lot of guys who do what I do. There's like we were talking about before we got started today. I go to a lot of these luncheons and stuff like that. Between the ages of 60 and 30, there's probably 4 or 5 of us in the room, and it's 1 or 2 guys working one guy working South Texas, one guy working East Texas, one guy working Louisiana, and then one guy working another part of Texas, maybe another guy working Louisiana. So there might be 5 of us between that kind of age of 30 to 50 doing between 30 and 60 really doing exploration. And then from 60 to 80, there's a whole lot of guys, but Geologists, they just don't retire. They just end up dying. So that's what I've really learned over the years, Jake. But
so if you had a young kid come to you and he was like, man, I'm obsessed with this, or here's this podcast, and he was just like, I just want to go punch holes in the ground. What advice do you give to him?
Go become an engineer. Go become a petroleum engineer.
Don't do it.
Don't do it. It's extracting oil from existing fields is a whole lot easier than doing explorations. It's tough. It's a tough business.
Yeah,
takes a lot of intestinal fortitude,
mm-hmm.
and you have to be able to stomach a lot.
Yeah,
it's very high stakes gambling with science supported. Very
mm-hmm.
high stakes science supported gambling is how I describe it.
Where do you typically start? Like, let's just look at a project from ground zero. Is it you're talking to people, you're getting hunted? Let's just assume that it's an area where there's nothing, right? So you have no other wells that have been drilled. Where do you start in like the technical process?
So my company, New Horizon Oil and Gas, I call it analog based exploration. So I kind of try to stay in basins that are close to production. If you're going off to a completely different basin where there's no wells at all, that's pure wildcatting. That's very, 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 very high risk. What I do is kind of lower, it's more of almost development exploration is what we're looking for here.
Yeah.
Where I could say, over here in Vermilion Parish, there's a well that drilled till 17,000 feet, and they found, 100 feet of pay in the Sipe D sand. I'm going to follow that along the trend into like Cameron Parish and look and see if I have any data over there. And if I have data over there, I'll start exploring for that, kind of that same Sipe D sand over there in Cameron Parish. It's kind of how it works. Is like I just kind of follow these trends. What's interesting is these seismic. The way they shot seismic is not on trends. They shot seismic by making a box and just shooting the seismic. And so the key is having access to these seismic that you kind of put the trends together, and you kind of can see trends as they go from like west to east. As Mississippi was depositing sands a long time ago, just kind of how they were spread throughout time.
I've always isn't it? Maybe this is just me not understanding it, but don't we have enough like data, whether it be seismic or logs or other stuff, to where we could, in theory, use some sort of like AI to like map the subsurface, like some sort of like 3D visualization, and then just like boom, we can de-risk it. Like I would imagine, because I mean, how much data do we have out there?
We have all the data, but some of the technology is when they shot the data, the technology was not as good as. The technology for the newer 3Ds are a whole lot better. Like the offshore 3Ds are a whole lot better. So there's a whole lot more human error on these onshore 3Ds, and that's kind of why I stayed there. Focus there is because the stuff that was shot, there's still a whole lot of human error that goes in these things. Like, in fact, I was working a survey, and a lot of times what I do is I find a survey that doesn't look right and try and figure out what happened during acquisition or what happened during processing, and can we figure out the solution to that survey and kind of crack the code on that particular 3D survey and figure out, well, why these giant reserves not lighting up like they should? Or is there, because if you go into a survey and you have one or two things light up and then you have some other stuff that's harder to see, you got to figure out exactly what's going on there.
So do you think with the new technology, give it another, 5 years with how crazy things are progressing with it, could we map the subsurface?
You could, but
could we get to the point to where it's like we know exactly where the resources are, and we could just and then unlock essentially all of this stuff that we could never tap into before?
I think some of these areas that are less complex, you definitely could, that are not as like in West Texas where it's a little more flat and stuff like that, and some of these areas where there's not as much geology going on, because it still does take human people to go in and kind of like tie everything together and put the story together. Yeah. So I think you still will have, even myself, like I have low overhead. I try to hire consultants and people come in. Don't have, I just don't hire a lot of employees right now, and just kind of keep things simple and small. Because what's interesting is even the advent of PowerPoint. Like I was talking to another gentleman in the industry not too long ago about it. Putting together a prospect to go find people to fund. I used to take months to put that prospect together and to basically go get it drafted. You'd have to go to a draftsman. You have to go back and forth in draftsman. Then you'd have to call and set up all these appointments in New Orleans. And you'd have to literally get in the car and drive to New Orleans and show a prospect or something like that. Or you have to go somewhere. It just was inconvenient. But now with like the advent of like PowerPoint, just something simple like PowerPoint, putting all your displays in PowerPoints, it makes everything a whole lot easier. And then you can have a Zoom meeting with someone and you don't have to travel. You spend a lot less time traveling. So the efficiency's gotten a lot better in the industry. A lot of jobs were eliminated. Like the draftsman, there's not even a single draftsman in the industry.
I hadn't even heard of that.
That was like a big job back in the 80s, 70s, and 80s.
Yeah. Did you ever hear about that? I can never remember the name of it. There was a company that was started by a guy out of the Jet Propulsion Labs at NASA, and he raised $400 million. And his whole pitch deck on like what he was raising money for, and he wasn't an oil and gas guy, by you, but he raised money from some very prominent oil and gas men, was that he was going to shoot seismic from the air.
Yes.
You heard of this? He bought some old decommissioned Russian jets.
Yeah.
Right, for like $20 million each. And then apparently had this proprietary technology, and he was just going to be flying over basins, just blasting down essentially this like seismic from the air.
Yeah.
And that's his whole thing, is like, we're just going to map everything and we're going to know instantly where all the resources are.
I don't think that worked out very well.
It didn't. I think he's in prison.
Okay.
Yeah, the whole thing was like this big fraud debacle and stuff. But it's, that was like in 02, 03. It was like early 2000s.
So people try a lot of different things to figure out, to crack the code, how to find
it. Obviously struck a nerve with like seasoned oil men who were putting a lot of cash behind it. They were like, wow, if this is possible, that would be amazing.
It was risk dollars, I guess you'd say.
Yeah.
If it would have worked, it could have been a home run. It was definitely a science experiment.
Yeah. And it was a really good fraud.
Yeah. But I've heard of some people doing stuff like that before. Just basically, I basically just go back to the basics, do an old school, subsurface geology on a project. If I find a prospect, I go in, look at the well. I go in and I actually pull every well log in the area. I make a subsurface map of what I think it looks like in the area. So not on computers, computer generated. Then I'll take that information after I map it on the subsurface and I'll plug it into the computers, and then I'll tie all the computers together and all that information and see how it looks there, and see if we actually have a prospect that holds up and can stand the scrutiny of the industry.
That's awesome. What are you most excited about?
What am I most excited about? I am most excited about drilling the next well. It's so fun to drill these wells. There's really no other feeling in the world quite like drilling.
Give me your best, like the highlight of your career in terms of like drilling a well. Like I think back to like, we've got a picture somewhere in the office, like our little shitty stripper well operation with me and Colin sitting in front of it. Like we literally put a camera up on the truck and a timer and like pose in front of it. And it was like the most gratifying thing, because it was like, we had this vision, be oilmen. It wasn't like crazy and grand, but we did it.
Yeah.
And it was like pat on the back. I was like proud of myself for it, So like, what was your story? What was your moment?
One of the first wells I drilled at Houston Energy, there was a well called Bayou Barataria we ended up drilling. And Manti Resources out of Corpus Christi was in the well.
I had a buddy used to work there.
Yeah, and so we were drilling the well, and Chuck, their geophysicist, was on there, and we're like, man, we haven't hit the target yet. We're not there. And it was like, are we ever going to hit it? Because it was like 200 feet came in. It was coming in deeper than we thought. So I was like, it was extremely nerve-wracking for me, because it was like one of the first wells I drilled at Houston Energy and put together, first prospect I put together at Houston Energy. And we finally hit the target. And Chuck called me up and was like, tell me all about it. And I was talking to Dale Coulthard, who worked at Houston Energy. He was like, we were pumped. It was a super exciting moment. It was like, yeah, I know what I'm doing. I can actually do this and, be on my own, and doing this, because in the past I've always worked with like Ben and stuff like that, working together on these projects. And this is one I put together myself and found it turned out to be a really nice well, with Manti. And I was like, yeah, I can actually do this. It gave me that vote of confidence, I guess, to like keep pressing forward. And I guess
I love it.
It's funny I heard you talk about that in another podcast, is like a lot of times you just got to keep doing the work no one else is willing to do and keep pressing, moving forward. That's the hardest part with the startup.
Yeah, it's just having that conviction that when things get hard, like that you're on the right path and that this is all worth it, and you kind of keep marching forward. And drilling a well still in my bucket list. I don't know if it's the smartest thing in the world, but it's on there.
Yeah.
It's a different thing buying wells, but actually drilling one and being successful just to check the box.
There was another time I did have one more experience where I did have 2 discoveries in one day. They're conventional wells. So like these unconventional guys, they're drilling like 10 wells a day.
Yeah.
But does it really count if it's unconventional? That's the question. I mean, not a whole lot of science is going in these unconventional wells. It's like you're just drilling into a shale bed or tight sand or something and fracking. I mean, I don't know if it really counts. I don't count it. Let's put it that way.
You're going to have some of these unconventional guys wanting to fight you after this.
Probably. But different geology, just different. It's more of mining than it is actual. And there's art to doing. I feel like there's art to doing what I do.
Yeah.
Whereas the other unconventional is more of a mining operation.
Yeah.
And like the guys, a lot of my mentors are just phenomenal guys, and true artists in what they do.
Jarrod, this has been awesome. We'd never talked to anybody who's actually focused on exploration. I didn't know there was any of you left, and so you may be the only one we ever have on. But this was fascinating. So really enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed talking to you as well, Jake. And nice to meet you.
If you guys like the episode, take 2 seconds, share with your friends, share with all your colleagues. We'll catch you guys on the next episode.